One morning, about a month after our last confrontation, I walked out to the barn and found something strange. The cattle were acting nervous, moving in erratic patterns like they'd been spooked. I headed over to the water trough, and that's when I saw it. A pile of some strange powder scattered around the edge. It didn't take a genius to figure out what it was. I crouched down, scooping a bit of it into a bag to have it tested later, but I had a sinking feeling in my gut. Someone had tried to poison my herd. I called the vet immediately. Hi, my name is Steven, and I've lived on my farm for close to 15 years now. And until last spring, things were peaceful. It's the kind of life I always wanted. Quiet, steady work, and a sense of pride in knowing the land was mine. The house wasn't much, but it had enough room for me and my dogs. And the pastures stretched far enough to keep a small herd of cattle. My closest neighbor, Hank Reeves, had owned the farm next door since before I moved in. He kept to himself mostly, though I'd see him around town from time to time. We'd wave, maybe exchange a few words, but that was the extent of our relationship. That all changed when Mark Calder bought the place after Hank passed away. Mark was an odd sort of guy right from the start. He didn't come around to introduce himself like most folks would when moving to a new place. Instead, he kept his distance, always looking out over his land like he was sizing it up, figuring out what he could do with it. I didn't think much of it at first. Everyone has their quirks, and being a little strange isn't a crime. But soon I realized Mark was more than just quirky. He was downright eccentric. It started small. He'd plow his fields at odd hours of the night, the sound of his tractor rumbling through the dark, waking me up at 2 or 3 in the morning. I told myself it wasn't worth worrying about. Everyone has their own way of doing things. But the real trouble began the day I found him standing on my side of the property line. I'd been out checking the fence that ran between our land, making sure it was holding up after a storm had passed through the night before. That's when I saw him, standing there with his hands on his hips, looking at the dirt. Hey, Mark, everything all right? Your fence is a bit crooked. Yeah, no. Crooked? It looks pretty straight to me. It's very crooked. It's leaning a bit onto my side. If I were you, I would have it torn down and remade, but put on your own property rather than mine. That fence has been there since I bought the place. It's on the property line. Maybe you didn't notice, but I think you're taking a bit more than your fair share. If I didn't know better, I would assume that you've been slowly moving the fence and slowly stealing some of my land from me. I was stunned. The idea that I was encroaching on his land was ridiculous. I'd had the property surveyed when I first moved in. I knew exactly where the property line was. I would never do that. Plus, you would have noticed me moving this fence. It's incredibly long. That fence is right where it's supposed to be. You think so, huh? You saying that I'm crazy? Well, I happen to know that not only have you been slowly moving it and stealing my land, but that you have also stolen some of my cattle too. That is ludicrous. I would never do that. Uh-huh. Sure you wouldn't. Well, you just watch your back there, bud. That was the first time I realized something was off about Mark. He wasn't just peculiar. He was looking for trouble. I walked away that day, thinking it was a one-time thing. I figured he was just trying to test his new neighbor, see if he could push me around a little. But it wasn't long before the real battle began. Over the next few weeks, I noticed small changes around the fence line. At first, it was just a few stakes moved a few inches into my side of the property. Then it was pieces of the fence itself that seemed to shift overnight, posts leaning in Mark's direction one day and towards me the next. I'd fix them, only to find them moved again a few days later. One morning, I found the wire fence cut clean through, a long strip of it lying on the ground like some invisible hand had sliced it during the night. Angrily, I marched over to Mark's house. When he opened the door, he looked at me with that same infuriatingly calm expression. What can I do for you, neighbor? You can stop cutting my fence for starters. I know that you think that the fence is on your property, but we had the land surveyed, and the fence marks the border between our lands. Please stop moving it. Cutting your fence? I don't know what you're talking about. Don't play dumb with me. That fence isn't moving on its own. You're awful paranoid, friend. Maybe you ought to relax a little. That was it. I knew I wasn't going to get anywhere with him by talking, so I started documenting everything, taking pictures of the fence, marking the boundary line more clearly, even talking to the local sheriff, though they didn't seem too interested. Property disputes between farmers were common enough around these parts, and the sheriff wasn't eager to get involved unless things got out of hand. Little did I know, things were about to get much worse. One morning, about a month after our last confrontation, I walked out to the barn and found something strange. The cattle were acting nervous, moving in erratic patterns like they'd been spooked. I headed over to the water trough, and that's when I saw it. A pile of some strange powder scattered around the edge. It didn't take a genius to figure out what it was. I crouched down, scooping a bit of it into a bag to have it tested later, but I had a sinking feeling in my gut. Someone had tried to poison my herd. I called the vet immediately, and thankfully, none of the animals had gotten sick. But it was clear what had happened. Mark was escalating. First, it was the land, then the fence, and now he was going after my livelihood. If he'd succeeded in poisoning the cattle, I'd be ruined. This wasn't just a nuisance anymore. It was war. I went straight to Mark's house and started pounding on his front door until he opened it, a sly grin on his face.
Something on your mind, neighbor?
You tried to poison my cattle. Mark, I get that you're upset about the fence, but we can settle this really easily by having someone come out and survey the land.
Now, why would I do a thing like that? I mean, I guess if your cattle died, you would go broke and have to sell your land, but I can't imagine that could happen. You use a well for your drinking water, right, Stephen?
I stepped closer, my fists clenched at my sides. He was right. I did use a well, and I took his meaning that he could just as easily have poisoned it rather than the watering hole. He had just threatened to kill me, and over the location of a fence, no less. It was insane. You're playing a dangerous game, Mark. I'm warning you, stay off my land and stay away from me and my animals.
You don't scare me, Stephen. You may think I'm a joke, but I'll show you. I'll make you regret ever looking down your nose at me.
I wanted to hit him right then and there, but I knew that wasn't going to solve anything. Instead, I turned and walked away, my mind racing. If he wanted to play dirty, I could play dirty too. I had no idea what had given him the idea that I thought lesser of him, but he clearly wasn't going to change his mind. Over the next few days, I went online and spoke with some friends that worked for law enforcement, and with their help, I started digging into Mark's past. Turns out, he had a long history of trouble. Lawsuits, property disputes, even a restraining order or two from former neighbors. He was a grifter, always looking for the next place to cause trouble. Armed with this knowledge, I set my plan in motion. Late one night, after Mark had turned in for the evening, I crept onto his property. I wasn't going to damage anything, but I wanted to give him a taste of his own medicine. I moved a few fence posts, just enough to throw him off. I scattered some harmless powder around his barn, enough to make him think twice about poisoning my herd again. It was petty, but it felt good. I expected some kind of retaliation, but days passed without a word from Mark. Maybe he'd gotten the message. Maybe he'd back off now that he knew I wasn't going to take his crap lying down. I was wrong. One evening, everything came to a head. I was out in the barn, finishing up the last of my chores, when I heard a noise in the bushes just beyond the tree line. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, shining it towards the sound. That's when I saw him. Mark was crouched near the barn, holding something in his hand. A handgun. What the hell are you doing?
You've crossed the line, Stephen. This is my land, and I'll be damned if I let you take it from me.
I backed up, trying to put some distance between us. You're out of your mind, Mark. Put the gun down. But he didn't listen. I heard the crack of the handgun and saw a flash, but thankfully Mark was a terrible shot, and the bullet went wide and didn't hit me. He then started running towards me, trying to close the gap in between us to make his next shot an easier one. As he ran, Mark tripped on the uneven ground, stumbling forward. As he hit the ground, I heard the gun go off twice, and then Mark lay there on the ground still and not moving. I rushed over, my heart pounding in my chest. The handgun was under him with his hand still on the trigger. Rolling him onto his back, I saw that when he had tripped and fell, that his finger had pulled the trigger when he hit the ground, but the gun had been pointed at himself when he did. There were 2 holes in his chest, and blood was pouring freely from both of them. His eyes were wide with shock, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Mark, stay with me, I'll get help. But it was too late. His breathing slowed, and within moments, he was gone. I stood there for a few minutes before calling the sheriff. I didn't think they would believe me about what had happened, but after doing an extensive investigation, they ruled it as an accident and cleared me of any charges. Mark had been a pain in my side for months, but I never wanted it to end like this. I kept the farm, kept my animals safe, and for the first time in a long while, I could breathe easy again. The land, it seemed, had settled the score. The property next door was eventually sold, and I'm happy to say that the new owner is a much more level-headed person. It's been over 7 years, and we haven't so much as had a single disagreement yet, and I hope to keep it that way. Thanks for watching. Make sure to subscribe and leave a comment down below saying I subscribed, and we will try our best to reply to your comment.